At dawn on April 9, 1961, people lined the tracks into Long Beach and lit road flares for the last train Los Angeles would ever run on rails it had built itself. 36 years before that, the same company operated something close to 1,100 miles of electric railway across 4 counties, more track than any interurban system in the country. 10,000 trains a day, at its peak. I've checked that number twice, because it's hard to square with a city now famous for having none of it left. By the end, you'll know exactly wow. Hitch Decisions took the system apart and how much of it is still running under Los Angeles. The story starts in May of 1901, in a letter from a banker named Isaiah Hellman to a railroad man named Henry Huntington. Hellman had run banking in Southern California for close to 3 decades, and he told Huntington plainly that the time had come to build suburban railroads out of the city. Huntington had just lost a fight for control of the Southern Pacific Railroad to a rival, E.H. Harriman, and he needed somewhere else to put his ambition. He put it into Los Angeles. The two men incorporated the Pacific Electric Railway of California later that year, and their first project opened on July 4th, 1902, a line running from downtown Los Angeles to Long Beach. On its first afternoon, 2,000 residents of Long Beach watched 30,000 visitors arrive by rail. That same line would be the last one running, 59 years later. Here's the part that gets skipped in most tellings. Fares were never where Pacific Electric made its money. Land was. Huntington and his partners bought farmland out of the tracks, ran the line through it, then sold house lots along the route for several times what the raw land had cost. The fare was close to a loss leader. When Harriman tried to undercut Huntington with a cut-rate franchise proposal in 1903, Huntington answered with a ticket book. 500 miles of travel for $6.25. That's a little over a penny a mile in 1903 money, and the city council couldn't believe a company could survive selling rides that cheap. It couldn't. Not on fares alone. It survived on the land underneath the fares. The numbers make the arithmetic plain. In 1905, the railway's best year for profit in its entire early history, Pacific Electric earned $90,711 running trains. The Huntington Land and Improvement Company, selling the ground those same trains ran through, made $151,000 that same year and climbed to $402,000 by 1907. The railway's best year for running trains barely matched a third of what the land company made 2 years later, selling the ground underneath it. The rails were the advertisement. The land was the product. Whole towns came out of this arithmetic. Huntington Beach was incorporated in 1909, developed by a real estate company Huntington owned outright. Redondo Beach worked the same way. Huntington bought the local railway there in 1905 specifically because it came bundled with 90% of the land in the beach community, and the announcement alone started a land boom that paid back his investment before a single new rail was laid. By September of 1911, the arrangement had grown large enough that the Southern Pacific folded most of the region's electric lines into a single company under the Pacific Electric name. 2,160 trains a day, over 1,000 miles of track. The largest interurban electric railway on Earth. It had gotten that size chasing real estate, not ridership. Southern Pacific now owned the largest share. Huntington kept running a separate city streetcar company, the Los Angeles Railway, painted yellow instead of red, and the two systems would spend the next 5 decades as neighbors rather than rivals. By 1920, in most of the territory the system covered, the easy land was gone. By 1925, Pacific Electric had grown to its full size, and it would never get any bigger. The 4 districts of the system reached out in almost every direction you could travel from downtown Los Angeles, north to Pasadena and the San Gabriel Valley, east past San Bernardino toward the desert edge at Redlands, south through Watts to Long Beach and San Pedro, west to Hollywood, Santa Monica, and the string of beach towns the company itself had built. Something close to 1,100 miles of track, or 1,061, depending which historian's count you use. 900 cars, 2,700 trains a day, 4 counties. That's more electrified track than any interurban system built anywhere in the country, before or since. The last big piece went in on February 7th, 1926. A mile-long double-track subway running from a new office tower at 4th and Hill Streets out under Bunker Hill toward Glendale, Burbank, and Hollywood. It let 3 of the busiest lines skip the worst of downtown's automobile traffic entirely, and it worked. At its busiest, close to 880 cars a day used that single tunnel, carrying something on the order of 20 million passengers a year through less than a mile and a half of concrete. The company had built its own subway 3 decades before anyone thought Los Angeles needed one. None of it looked like decline yet. The company's own terminal at 6th and Main had been the tallest building in the city when it opened 2 decades earlier. The system was so wow, then into daily life in the region, that the comedian Harold Lloyd built an entire extended chase sequence around it in his 1924 film Girl Shy, commandeering a red car mid-route after finding the first one too crowded and driving it at speed through Culver City and Los Angeles. Audiences in 1924 didn't need the joke explained to them. Everybody in the theater had ridden one of these cars themselves, at least once that week. Stand there a minute. Picture an ordinary weekday morning on that same system before any of what comes later. Picture a Tuesday morning in 1925. You'd be standing on the platform at 6th and Main a few minutes before 8, and the air would already carry a faint smell of ozone off the overhead wire before you could see a single car come in. A red train would arrive from the Long Beach line every 6 or 7 minutes, and the platform never really emptied out between them. You'd hand a dime to the conductor, maybe 15 cents if you were going all the way to Long Beach, and he'd punch your transfer without looking at you twice, because he'd already punched a few thousand of these before lunch most days. The cars would still smell faintly of varnish if they were newer stock, and of dust and hot electrical windings if they were older. Wicker seats on some, leather on the newer steel cars that had come in after the war. A man across the aisle would have the morning paper folded down to the racing page, and a woman near the front would be minding 2 children who were far more interested in the third rail warning signs bolted to the platform posts than in anything happening inside the car. The conductor's uniform would be dark wool even. In July, brass buttons, a cap with the company's initials stitched above the brim. Once the train cleared the paved streets of downtown, the city would give way fast. Bean fields first, then citrus groves running in long straight rows, then the flat open ground between Los Angeles and Watts that the company itself had surveyed and sold in house lots 20 years before you were riding through it. A boy would climb aboard around Slauson selling the afternoon paper before it was technically afternoon yet, working car to car until the conductor waved him off at the next stop. Somewhere past Florence, the conductor would call the name of the station in a flat, worn voice, the kind that comes from saying the same word several thousand times a year until it barely sounds like a place anymore. Just a sound that means slow down. At every grade crossing, a signal the company itself had invented years earlier would clang and wave a red target back and forth, warning wagons and the growing number of automobiles that a train was coming through. Riders called it the wigwag, and it worked well enough that other railroads copied the design within a few years of Pacific Electric installing the first one. A few of those exact signals, or ones built to the same design, are still bolted to street corners in Southern California today, decades after the trains that needed them stopped running. You would not be thinking about any of this. That's the part worth sitting with. Nobody riding that Long Beach car on an ordinary Tuesday in 1925 was thinking about the 4 counties this system reached, or the 900 cars it ran, or the land deals that had put the rails under their feet in the first place. You'd be thinking about work, or the heat, or whether you'd remembered your lunch. The system was simply how you got from one place to another, the way your parents had gotten from one place to another on the same rails, and the way, if you'd been asked, you would have assumed your own children would get around Los Angeles for the rest of their lives. By the time the train pulled into the Long Beach terminal, a little before 9, you'd have ridden past 4 separate towns the company had built specifically. So people like you would need a reason to ride its rails. You wouldn't have noticed that either. That was rather the point of the whole arrangement. The profit was never supposed to be visible from inside the car. The return trip that evening would look almost identical, just reversed. Same platform, different light, the same conductor, or one very much like him punching the same kind of transfer. If you rode this route often enough, you'd learn to recognize which car tended to run on time and which one didn't. The way anyone learns the habits of a system they use every day without ever thinking of it as a system at all. That was true in 1925. It would not stay true for very much longer, though nobody on that platform had any way of knowing it yet. By the end of that same year, on the least profitable branches of the system, some of the runs on this exact route were already being made by motor bus instead. By around 1920, the mechanism the hook promised you had already started working against the system that built it. Pacific Electric had never made money carrying passengers. It had made money selling the land those passengers moved into. And by this point, across most of the system's reach, that land had already been sold. Huntington and his partners had done exactly what they set out to do: turn open farmland into subdivided lots, several times over in value. And once a parcel was sold, there was no second sale left to fund the railway underneath it. The railway kept running because it had a franchise obligation to keep running, not because running it still made the kind of sense it had made in 1905. At the same moment, the thing the rails had helped build, a region full of people who could now afford to live spread out, started working against the rails directly. Car registrations in Los Angeles County climbed from something like 140,000 in 1919 to over 700,000 a decade later. Streets that had once belonged mostly to streetcars now had automobiles parked or idling across the same rails, and speeds fell everywhere the system ran through city traffic instead of open right-of-way. On the Santa Monica Boulevard line through Hollywood, average speed dropped to something close to 13 miles an hour at its worst, slower than a determined bicycle. A train that share. A lane with automobiles runs at the speed of automobiles, and by the late 1920s in Los Angeles, that speed was falling every year. The company's own response tells you everything about how undramatic this process actually was. As early as 1925, the same year the system reached its full size, the least used red car routes were already being quietly handed over to motor buses, one branch line at a time, with no announcement and no single decision anyone could point to later. Nobody stood up and killed Pacific Electric in 1925. Somebody in an accounting office simply noticed that a particular branch line was losing money, it no longer had a land sale to cover, and switched it to a cheaper form of transportation. That happened dozens of times over the next 15 years, on different lines, for slightly different reasons, and it added up to the same thing every time. Individual lines tell the same story in miniature. The Sawtell line, running through what's now West Los Angeles, carried something over 2.5 million riders in a single year at its own peak in 1929. By 1940, Pacific Electric was running exactly one car a day on that route, just often enough to keep its operating franchise technically alive before abandoning it outright that November. The Fullerton line, serving Citrus Country in what's now Orange County, lost $1,610 in a single year in the mid-1930s hauling passengers, while its freight business, carrying the same region's oranges and lemons, kept the line alive for freight purposes into the early 1960s, more than 2 decades after the last passenger train ran there. Further east, the Ontario and San Antonio Heights line had started life in 1887 as a mule-powered operation before Pacific Electric electrified it in 1895 and folded it into the system in 1912. Its northernmost section was abandoned in 1924. The same year the company was still budgeting $1 million for the new downtown subway. The remaining stretch to Ontario followed it into abandonment in 1928. A branch line could be dying quietly at one end of the system in the same year the system was still expanding at the other end. Both things were true about Pacific Electric at once for most of its history. By 1938, the Whittier and Fullerton passenger line was gone. Redondo Beach, Newport Beach, and the Sawtell line through Santa Monica followed in 1940. None of these closures made front-page news. Each one was, on its own, a reasonable accounting decision about a single, unprofitable branch. None of this meant Pacific Electric was a failing company across the board. Freight told an entirely different story. By the early 1950s, the railway had become the third LA largest originator of online freight tonnage in the state of California, hauling citrus, oil, and warehouse goods across the same rails increasingly abandoned by passengers. As late as 1953, half of the company's revenue still came from riders. None of that revenue produced any actual profit. The freight side subsidized a passenger side that the land sale model had stopped subsidizing 30 years earlier. Pacific Electric also did something worth noting here, because it complicates any story that blames outside bus interests for what happened later. In 1923, when an outside businessman proposed starting the city's first independent bus company, Pacific Electric and the Los Angeles Railway didn't fight the idea. They preempted it, proposing their own bus operation instead, and won a public referendum for the right to run it themselves in May of that year. By 1925, that company was running 53 miles of bus routes, second only to Chicago nationally. The same company that operated the largest electric railway on Earth had already built the very buses that would eventually replace it, years before any outside consortium entered the picture at all. In 1936, on its second busiest line out of the new downtown subway, Pacific Electric tried something drastic, pulling the electric cars off the run to Glendale and Burbank entirely, substituting motor buses, keeping only a handful of aging wooden cars for the worst of rush hour. It did not work. The buses were smaller and slower than the trains they replaced, and the riders on that line, who had put up with plenty over the previous decade, did not put up with this. They complained loudly enough and consistently enough that the California State Railroad Commission stepped in. In 1939, the commission ordered Pacific Electric not only to restore full-time rail service on the Glendale-Burbank line, but to buy new equipment for it. 30 streamlined cars of a new design called the PCC, the first double-ended, multiple-unit PCC cars built for any railway in the country. They entered service in 1940, brand new streetcars running on a line the company had tried to abandon 4 years earlier. The early cars were the only new equipment Pacific Electric bought after 1924. Streamlined steel bodies, rubber-cushioned wheels built to run quieter than anything else in the fleet, painted in the same red the company had used since before most of their riders were born. They would still be running the Glendale-Burbank line 15 years later, on the night that line finally closed for good. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates any tidy story about inevitable decline. For a few years in the late 1930s, regular riders and a state regulator won an argument against a railroad company that wanted to cut costs, and the railroad company lost. The system that eventually vanished did not vanish because nobody ever tried to stop any part of it. It vanished because winning one fight over one line in 1939 did nothing to change the arithmetic underneath the entire network. Then came a war, and for a few years the arithmetic itself seemed to reverse. And then there was a date, or rather several of them stacked closer together than anything since 1925. By the end of 1941, Los Angeles County's population had started climbing toward numbers nobody had planned for, as war industries pulled workers from across the country into shipyards and aircraft plants around the region. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber for tires was rationed even harder. And for the first time in 15 years, more people needed Pacific Electric than the system could comfortably carry. At its busiest point, sometime toward the end of the war, the company was dispatching more than 10,000 trains a day. 10,000. That's roughly 4 times the daily train count the system had run at its own physical peak in the 1920s, on a network that, by this point, had already lost several of its branch lines to the bus conversions of the previous decade. The company had never carried more people, on more trains, on less track. This is the part that does not fit the story most people already believe about how this system died. It did not fade out quietly while everyone stopped riding it. At its most crowded moment in 59 years of operation, the equipment was old. Deferred maintenance was everywhere, and the company was still, by any measure, indispensable to a region that had nearly doubled in population within a few years. Then the war ended, and the choice that mattered most was made by people who were not trying to kill anything. Local, county, and state governments agreed that Southern California needed a serious infrastructure investment to handle the population that intended to stay after 1945. They chose freeways. Planners in the 1930s had actually sketched interurban rail into the center medians of the freeway system on paper. A rail line running down the middle of the road the way some cities still do it today. That plan was never built. According to at least one historian of the system, resistance from the California Department of Highways to including rail transit in freeway medians helped seal the outcome early, well before Pacific Electric's last trains stopped running. Large-scale land acquisition for the new freeways began in 1951. 4 of them, the Hollywood, the Arroyo Seco, the Harbor, and the San Bernardino, were already carrying traffic or close to it. Where a rail right-of-way happened to sit exactly where a freeway needed to go, the freeway won every time, because nobody with the authority to decide was weighing the two options as equals anymore. The freeway had already been chosen well before anyone sold a single bus ticket to replace a train. By 1953, Pacific Electric's own management had done the math on refurbishing what remained of the system versus simply converting the rest to buses, and it came out in favor of buses. On October 1st of that year, Southern Pacific sold the entire passenger operation, every remaining route, every station, every garage, to a newly formed private company called Metropolitan Coach Lines. The man running Metropolitan Coach Lines, Jesse Hoff, had previously worked for a firm called Pacific City Lines, a company connected in other American cities to a bus and tire consortium that included General Motors. That connection is real, and it's also easy to overstate. Pacific Electric itself had never been owned by that consortium. It had spent its entire operating life under Southern Pacific, a steam railroad with every incentive to keep freight profitable and passenger service exactly as unprofitable as it had always been. On June 19, 1955, the last electric train ever to carry passengers through the Hollywood subway pulled out of the subway terminal building with a hand-lettered banner across its front, reading simply, "To Oblivion." Nobody knows for certain which employee made that sign, or whether a supervisor approved it. It's one of the only jokes NEO connected to this system appears to have made about its own ending, and it turned out to be accurate. Within days, the tracks were pulled out of the tunnel, the Toluca substation was switched off, and the subway terminal building was sealed. In 1958, the state of California and the newly formed Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority bought what remained of the system from Metropolitan Coach Lines and began operating every surviving line as one public network for the first time in the company's history. Public ownership did not save the system. It only changed who signed the closure order. The Long Beach line, the very first route the company had built, back on July 4, 1902, turned out to be the last one standing, outlasting every other piece of a network that had once stretched into 4 counties. The last regular scheduled train on that line ran on April 8, 1961. The last train of any kind, a farewell special packed with rail fans who had followed the system's slow closure for years, ran the following morning. People who had spent months collecting signatures to save. The line lined the tracks into Long Beach before sunrise on April 9th and set off road flares, the way you might light a way home for someone rather than say goodbye to them. A tower car, the kind used for maintenance work on the overhead wire, followed the special train in from Watts that morning. Its own work was finished too. After that run, a significant amount of the system's remaining equipment became obsolete within days. 59 years after its first run, on the same route it had opened with, Pacific Electric stopped. PAX. Pacific Electric was not quite the whole story of electric rail in Los Angeles. A related but separate company, the Los Angeles Railway, had run the city's local yellow-liveried streetcars since 1895, painted differently, and legally its own operation since 1910. It survived Pacific Electric by almost exactly 2 years. Its own last streetcar, on a route labeled the V Line, ran on March 31st, 1963. After that morning, for the first time since electric streetcars had appeared on Los Angeles streets in 1887, there was not one electrically powered rail vehicle running anywhere in the city. Not every car went to the scrapyard before then. A number of Pacific Electric cars survive today at railway museums in Southern California, restored and sitting on short stretches of track that go nowhere in particular, kept running only for visitors on weekends. One old commuter car, decommissioned decades ago, was hauled up into the San Bernardino Mountains near Cresleen and turned into an actual house, first as a logger's bunkhouse in the 1930s and later as somebody's home, a use it still serves today. Most of the fleet went the ordinary way equipment goes when nobody needs it anymore. A handful of cars went the strange way instead, and one of them is still somebody's address. The brand itself outlived the company by decades. In 2003, the Port of Los Angeles built 2 brand new replica red cars and ran them along the San Pedro waterfront as a tourist shuttle, painted in the same red, styled after the same body design, carrying passengers who mostly wanted a photograph rather than a commute. That replica service itself stopped running on September 27, 2015, a second, much smaller closure of a much smaller thing wearing the same livery. By 1963, none of it, red or yellow, was running anywhere in Los Angeles. Cities across the rest of the country had been running an almost identical experiment the entire time. Chicago sold land the same way, built rail as the advertisement for it, and buried 3,000 of its own streetcars under a different stretch of asphalt. That's a separate story, told a different way, on a different afternoon. Other pieces of this one sit quietly around Los Angeles today, easy to walk past without noticing. The tunnel entrance at Belmont, he won the To Oblivion train rolled out of, still exists, sealed shut, painted over with a mural of a red trolley car, tucked into a small park behind an apartment complex in the Westlake district. The subway terminal building itself at 4th and Hill spent decades as ordinary office space before developers converted it into apartments in 2007, keeping the original facade intact over tenants who mostly have no idea their building once had 6 underground platforms beneath it. What's left of Pacific Electric in Los Angeles includes museum pieces, but it doesn't stop there. Some of it is a functioning railroad, running trains today. In 1990, Los Angeles opened its first modern light rail line since 1961, running largely along the graded, banked, engineered right-of-way that Pacific Electric had built for its very first route in 1902. It's been rebuilt, rewired, and renamed more than once since then, running for years as the Blue Line before becoming, in 2019, part of what is now called the A Line. But underneath the current rail sits close to a century and a quarter of continuous engineering history on the exact same ground. In 2025, that line carried something on the order of 22 million passengers, more riders in a year than Pacific Electric's entire network carried at its own wartime peak. There's a station on that line today called Wardlow, sitting on a stretch of right-of-way that is, by name and by deed, the historic route of the Pacific Electric Railway. Trains come through roughly every 8 minutes during rush hour, and most of the people standing on that platform checking their phones have no reason to know that the ground under their feet was surveyed, graded, and laid with steel before their grandparents were born, dismantled once within their own parents' lifetimes, and rebuilt on the same alignment once the region decided it needed rail again after all. What I can't stop thinking about is that platform at Wardlow. How ordinary it looks, waiting for a train the same way people waited there in 1925, on ground that's already been abandoned once and brought back. One more thing we had, and set down, and walked away from.